Hello everyone, my name is Naomi De Los Santos, and today I will be doing my presentation on racism in Brazil. I chose to speak about this topic after seeing the movie City of Gods, and a lot of it has to do with my past research on racism in Brazil, and just watching the movie kind of brought me back into understanding my research on the racism that actually does take place within the country. So, before going on into explaining City of God and the racism that exists within that movie, I would like to give you a background of Brazil and their slavery and racism that actually took place years ago and is actually kind of still taking place today. So, as we all may know, Brazil was part of the triangular slave trade. And as a matter of fact, it was a country that actually has the biggest import of slaves, so much to the point that 50% or more of the civilians in the country are of African descent. And soon after, 90% of the people residing in the country that are of African descent were actually born there, which speaks volumes about the amount of Africans that were imported into the country. So predominantly, Brazil is of African descent. The people living there are, it's a huge mixture of people, Portuguese, and a huge mixture of other people. And the country is known to have so many integrated cultures together. However, they're not necessarily known for being one of the most racist countries. And in reality, they probably are facing a huge amount of racism, but it is not heavily spoken about. Um, so much to the point that slavery was abolished in 1988 in Brazil, and to think that it was only 22 years ago and where slavery was abolished amongst all the countries that were part of the triangular slave trade speaks volumes. Me, for example, I'm 21 years old, and to know that only a year before I was born, that's when slavery was abolished within the country, states a lot about whether or not racism does exist. And in my opinion, just my opinion, not based on the research that I've done on racism within that country, I believe that there is racism because me living here in the United States and slavery has been abolished in our country far way before Brazil has, and we still see racism within the people, and it is very obvious. And I myself am an example of being racially profiled or experiencing discrimination because of my race. So I know that that's pretty. How could we not say that it is the same in Brazil, where you do have pretty much the same ordeal that you see in the United States, and where you see different cultures and predominantly black, where here we are the majority, but however we are the minority as well, and we see that in Brazil. To give you some examples of how racism does exist in Brazil, as a matter of fact, before I actually get into that, I would like to explain to you guys that although racism does exist in Brazil, Brazil is known as being hypocritical and what's the word to describe this? Contradicting, because they kind of hide behind the fact that they're not racist and that their country does not deal with a lot of racist issues when in reality they do. Research was conducted in where 90% of the people in the country stated that racism is prevalent and it does exist, but only 4% of these people admitted to actually being racist. That speaks a lot in itself in denoting that these people are, dealing with a racist country and they don't necessarily face it. So, after doing my research, I concluded that the people in Brazil admit that there is racism going on, but they don't like to take part in it. They mainly focus on, well, yeah, racism does exist, but I don't take no part in it, and I personally am not racist. And they just basically blame everything on everyone else, and anything that has to do with racism is blamed on everyone else. Another example, a very recent example of this hidden racism within the country is an artist that goes by the name of Tiririca. This artist right now is being sued for, I believe, for racial or derogatory terms. So he's being sued for being racist, pretty much. And this comes from a song that he actually wrote, and where he's describing black women as women that stink and smell like skunk. So he's being trialed for this, and it's a big deal right now in Brazil as to why he would write such a song. And reporters and different analysts of the situation have stated that it's very hypocritical, and they feel like they're using this artist as a scapegoat to kind of show to the rest of the world that they're not racist and they're hiding behind that, when in reality there has been different artists before in the past that have even made it to Carnival and have made it to the mainstream, and they have had songs that speak horribly about black people, speaking about black men and black women, and how profoundly how bad of a race it is to be black, and speaking horribly about their culture and their smell and what they eat and things of that nature. So for them to kind of sit here and try to criminalize this one man for his one song is, they see it as very hypocritical, because there has been instances before and where artists, known artists in the past, have done the same thing and they haven't been necessarily penalized for it. Another example would be they're hiring, well, it's up to see, but for the last 442 years, there hasn't been a black mayor in Brazil. And Sao Paulo is, which is a town in Brazil, they're voting now for a new mayor, and there is a possibility that there will be a black mayor, but 442 years of not having a black mayor from a country that is predominantly black and where the majority of the people are black, and to state that only it has been 442 years in where we don't see a black mayor, it speaks a lot, it speaks volumes as well. How could you sit there and say that your country is not necessarily racist, but look at the amount of years in where not even a black mayor has been hired? Um, Bringing it back to the movie, before I actually start speaking about the racism that takes place in the movie, I would like to give a quick synopsis of the movie. City of Gods is told from a narrator that isn't necessarily the protagonist of the movie. The movie is primarily about the protagonist, Little Z, and he's a gang member. He's the owner of the town. Um, the runs in the town, they actually grow to become the future for the town. They actually become the leaders of organized crime, which is pretty much what the movie is about. It's about a vicious cycle, like Nelson said in our voice thread in the last couple of weeks, where it is a vicious cycle where these kids are taught to um, be violent and rob and vandalize and things of that nature, and soon as they get older, they become the head don. So it's kind of like you're young, you go through this cycle where you might become the head of the town and then you die, and then those that die leave in hands the town to those young kids that have been in a sense training to become um, the head of the town. So pretty much this is what the movie is about. Little Z and his best friend kind of take over the town. Towards the end, the narrator, who's a photographer who uses his art to show the rest of the world that there is racism and violence within the town, actually in the end captures the ending of that throne, and demonstrates how the runs indeed will be the next leaders of this organized crime within the country. um, Racism within the movie. I feel like this movie to me is very interesting. Well, the first time I saw this movie, I was baffled. I was amazed because I actually thought back of my country in DR, and I feel like certain towns within the Dominican Republic, because the Dominican Republic is a very racist country as well. Certain aspects of the country reminds me of Rio de Janeiro here in the movie, and it's treated the way Rio de Janeiro is treated in Brazil in real life. I say that because Rio de Janeiro is located in the north side of Brazil, and they almost treat that part of the country um, as its own town, its own country, its own everything. And that goes back into what I'm saying about Brazil, about being about them being racist and actually segregating the cultures, but not necessarily stating that they are racist and that they do segregate. Um, Nowhere would you find anywhere in any scriptures and anything that you might read or anything you might research that states that Brazil is segregated, but in reality they are. And the way that they don't deal with these people is by basically isolating them in their own section. So going back to the movie and explaining why this is a vicious cycle, I feel like it's a vicious cycle because they're isolated. It's almost as if taking a group of people that do not know how to read, that do not have the best education, and just basically throwing them in a section of poverty, and where they don't know how to prosper, and where it does become a vicious cycle. And the highest that you could go in within that society is through violence, because you're not taught that education might be the way out, and that, through the cycle of going to school and having your kids go to school and you educating yourself and obtaining a career, and then your kids are also bound to do the same, it's not something that's being taught within the country. And that's a form of racism that I feel that if you watch the movie without knowing the background of Brazil, you won't necessarily understand. You won't necessarily capture that. You won't necessarily see that the vicious cycle comes from the isolation within the country. Although Brazil does not state that they do segregate the country depending on race, that is what's happening. And that brings me back to the civil rights movement within the United States, and where during that time the South was known as the slavery the slavery part of the country, where racism was very prominent, and the North was more of the free side, and where we didn't see much of that. And I see that in Brazil now, where Rio de Janeiro and those towns around there are predominantly black people, and they're treated as if they were their own town, while in the other side you see the more whitened part of the country, the people that will pass for Europeans. So although they're not purposely doing it and purposely, not sitting there saying, oh, I'm racist, that is a form of racism, because they're basically cutting those people off with little resource and letting them do their own thing. And this is why we see what we see in City of Gods. These people don't know any better. These people are basically locked in a cage, the way I see it, with no education, with lack of better knowledge as to how to better themselves. And I felt like I needed to present this to you guys and let you guys know that a lot of that has to do with, besides the fact that the movie is based on a real life story, a lot of that has to do with the way Brazil is shaped, and it's shaped behind racism, although they choose to not admit it. And they do admit that it's there, but they don't necessarily take fault in it. And I think that's where City of Gods comes from, and that's where the root of racism really derives from that in denial of racism actually going on in the country, but yet every action that's being taken towards people of color are racist actions. So I would like to leave that as a food of thought for you guys. Next time, maybe when you guys see the movie or analyze it, you guys could possibly consider that it comes from the root of the country. So.